Hi, my name's Matt, and I'm going to show you how I sculpted this carnival entrance in Blender with no prior experience sculpting in 3D. My initial inspiration was the vibe of the Welcome to Horrorland Goosebumps book, and I wanted to combine that with a little bit more of a traditional carnival look. And then I found this image of a carnival entrance that I thought was ideal for the level of skill that I'm at, but also the vibe I was going for. I highly recommend a more cartoonish or exaggerated sculpt for your first time. Regardless of what you choose, I think the tips that I'm giving will help you either way. After a bit more digging, I was able to find a decent front view and profile view of the carnival entrance. This is going to be essential for me to keep everything proportional as I'm sculpting it out. I aligned these reference images in my viewport along the rolled axes and as close to each other proportionally as I could. My images weren't perfect profile and front views, but it still turned out alright. I set the opacity to a slightly lower level so that I could still see my mesh. First, add a UV sphere, then subdivide and shade smooth. Blender can handle a decent amount of geometry. I went ahead and did 7 subdivisions, but really you should be adding just enough so that you can see the impact that your brush is making on the mesh without weird pointed vertices. Going too far will probably crash Blender or just give you a super laggy viewport. I also enabled mesh symmetry on the top right of the viewport so that whatever I was sculpting on one side would appear symmetrically on the other side as well. I started pulling the sphere into the general shape of the head and continually pulled things out as they appeared in the reference. I used a combination of draw, inflate, grab, crease, and a lot of smoothing. I created holes for the eyes and then added spheres to be the eyeballs. There was a moment here where things got a little bit away from me. By continually referring to the reference though, I was able to land somewhere that I was really happy with. I used a bit of sculpting in simple shapes to block out the mouth and teeth. I then used a Boolean modifier to carve out the mouth entrance hole, and that gave me some weird geometry. Booleans are not your friend. I probably should have added more subdivisions to the cylinder that I used to cut it. I would choose a different way to do this next time, but it still worked out. After placing the teeth, I used a shrink wrap modifier to make them adhere to the gums, and then I used a really slight solidify to the gums to make them sort of hug the teeth. After I had pulled out most of the main details of the sculpt, I could have added more subdivisions and really gone in and finessed more of those details in the creases, but I chose a more cartoonish and exaggerated reference on purpose, so I figured I could go in with Vertex Paint and layer those on top of the geometry work I had already done to get those details for cheaper. To set up a Vertex Paint layer, first navigate to Edit mode and then use the shortcut U to see the UV mapping options. Select Smart UV Project. Now move to Vertex Paint mode. At the top of the viewport, you'll see this attribute drop-down menu. Scroll down the menu and we're going to click the plus to add a new attribute. We'll call it Face. All this is doing is creating a canvas of the mesh that we'll be painting on. As you can see, I'm painting on this and nothing's showing up. So we're going to need to mix this attribute with the base color plugged into our principled BSDF in the shader editor. You can see here that I've got my texture set up, and we're going to add the attribute here, add both to a mixed color node, and then connect the output to our base color. Working off the reference, I started by painting the entire model that light bluish hue. Then I moved to a slightly darker version of that same color and went in and started giving details to the creases around the mouth, eyes, nose, and forehead. You can see that with Control Shift, I've soloed the Vertex Paint on the model. You can see that I'm pushing a lot more depth and shading in the creases and folds of the face for super cheap. I'm not having to finesse every vertex or add more geometry, and by being smart with my shading, I'm getting a lot more detail without battling the sculpt or overburdening my face count. I know that this isn't going to work for every sculpt, but for this reference, it totally worked out. I added these cones in to be the horns and applied a simple deform modifier. At first, I was confused why it wasn't doing anything, but then I realized that the bend relies on geometry density to work. So after adding some loop cuts, I got what I was looking for. A bonus little tidbit here was that when I had plugged my attribute into the mix color node, instead of using standard mix, I switched it to color burn. This gave it this spray paint type look, which I felt was way more grounded in what I would actually see if I was seeing this in the real world. So the sculpt is cool, but what's going to make this better is surrounding it with assets that reinforce the feeling of the world. So I added in some assets from an amusement park model pack that I had. I built this little ticket booth, and then I littered the ground with some hay and layered textures. Another part of unifying these assets was picking a brown color from the dirt and applying that in a light sheen over every asset in the scene. This made everything feel a little bit more lived in. The edges of the assets when they meet the ground don't feel as jarring now that they're taking on that mutual color. The texture that I gave the sculpted head was this plastic ABS that I thought, again, was true to the look that I would see if I was looking at it in real life. So this is where it really all came together. The sculpt is far from perfect. In fact, it has some pretty glaring issues in the mouth and base and back of the head, but I know that this is the angle that I want to show. So the base, the back of the head, and even most of the left side are visual information that the audience won't even see. So to highlight the best parts of the sculpt, I'm going to utilize lighting. When thinking about lighting, it's important to think about motivation, meaning what is happening in the scene that contributes to where light would be coming from. The time of day, the weather, or practical elements in the scene that already are emitting light. The first and most obvious source of light would be the circus tent that has string lights on it. So I could increase the emission of those lights, but instead I'm going to use those practical string lights as motivation to place a much larger area light that I have more control over coming from this side of the frame to blanket the area in a warm light. I can now see a bit more details on the sculpt, the ground, and the lighting makes sense because we can see the light bulbs on the tent. It's motivated. I've also decided that it's nighttime, so on the opposite side of the frame, I'm going to add a large blue tinted area light to be the moonlight. The angle and placement of an additional light like this is completely up to you. I liked the emphasis on the sculpt, our main focus of the scene, but also created some contrast with the other area light we've placed. The main thing here is avoiding the most common misstep that I do see pretty often is you don't want to create flat lighting. For example, if I instead place the moonlight coming from the same angle as the camera, we're not getting the same amount of visual interest. It's difficult to tell if I'm simulating moonlight or a completely different source of light. And essentially, we've flattened out the entire frame because there's much less contrast and variation in light value. So we're gonna go with the more interesting and clear choice here. When I started thinking about lighting up the carnival entrance, I again looked to real world reference. When you see carnivals like this that are thrown up in random towns, usually very quickly, they're lighting with just whatever they have available, which is usually string lights and these stake lights that are low angled pointing up at their facades. This is a cool little coincidence, probably not a coincidence. We're all familiar with the effect that a low angle light has on a face. It creates a harsh shadow underneath the eyes. It makes the entire thing look a little more spooky and menacing. So I'm gonna mimic that look. Not only is this gonna assist in making my mid-tier sculpt look stronger, but it's also mimicking a look that's referential to something that we are familiar with and would see in the real world. I spotlit the sculpt from below using these little stake lights as motivation. I even added a slightly wider spot on the right side to illuminate some of these palette props that I placed that were getting lost in the darkness. Once you have a motivation for light, it's a lot easier to get away with things that you think you might not be able to. Most people aren't going to be able to tell that I have two spots there and I'm cheating out a little bit further. I then brought in these wooden light poles to shine some extra light on the ground near the ticket booth and the foreground hay bales. Both areas that needed a little bit more light to be visible in the scene, but not so much that they pull focus. A general rule of thumb is that your audience is going to look to the brightest part of the frame first. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're deciding on the intensity of these other light additions. This is giving me some nice light variation and motivated visibility on these other props that I've placed in the scene. The last thing I thought would be really cool to add would be this red light that's emitting from the mouth of the carnival entrance. This light is not motivated. Hypothetically, you could argue that there might be some light inside the mouth that's creating this, but I think it draws this important point that there are rules in lighting, but there aren't really rules in lighting. I think it's great to establish the start of your lighting setup based on motivation. From there, you can make additions like this that are more motivated by the feeling of the scene, not necessarily motivated by anything real happening in the scene. What's cool about this is the red light feels slightly off, not knowing where the motivation of that light is. It gives it a little bit more of this supernatural, spooky feeling. This fully depends on your scene. I highly recommend breaking this rule on motivated lighting when you see that it's going to add more feeling to your scene. I then animated this really slight pull back to the camera and then rendered my animation in cycles. The final and major part of this piece was bringing everything into DaVinci and adding elements that reinforce the feeling. I sourced some ambiance, carnival outdoor sounds, and inserted a track that was actually the original inspiration for the piece to begin with. I used some color correction and DaVinci Resolve Film Look Creator to give the frame this gate and an old projected film flutter and weave. And it turned out sick. I learned a lot, and candidly, there were a lot of times when I was sculpting this where I thought, this looks bad, this is gonna be bad, I'm wasting my time, I should try to do something else. And I pushed through and it turned out okay. And by utilizing these other things that I know and I'm more comfortable with, helped me enhance and smooth out some of the bad parts about the thing that I'm still learning how to do. I hope that this inspires you to try to sculpt if you haven't, or if it's something that still intimidates you a little bit. If someone like me, who's never sculpted anything before, can do it, I believe in you. If any of these tips or explanations were helpful to you, consider dropping a follow and look out for more from me. Thanks for watching.